that they actually do have a potential suspect in the case, and the identity is rather shocking.
They're getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
We searched for Nancy Guthrie.
Theories that her sister Annie Guthrie, brother-in-law Tomaso Chioni, or brother Cameron Guthrie had been involved.
They threatened to kill Nancy Guthrie. We had not heard that until now. We always knew that there was a consequence threatened if you don't pay by Thursday. Then by Monday, there's a second deadline, and the consequence is that the money goes up, I think, to $6 million. But we never heard that the other consequence was that they threatened to kill Nancy Guthrie.
News Nation exclusive on the search for Nancy Guthrie. It's been over 2 months since she went missing, and despite all the national attention, we still have no idea what happened to her or where she might be.
The press conferences started happening and the interviews with Nanos. What were you thinking?
Shut your mouth. Stop talking. That's pretty much what we were all saying, is why is he out there saying?
And yesterday, TMZ reported activity in a Bitcoin account connected to a ransom note.
The FBI says it is investigating multiple possible ransom notes, demanding Bitcoin as part of the search for Nancy Guthrie.
Tied to that Bitcoin account related to those potentially ransom demands.
Well, TMZ is saying that it's received a new note demanding 1 Bitcoin, which is about $68,000 in exchange for the name of the individual involved in Guthrie's disappearance. This is now the 3rd note in the case, and the demands for Bitcoin payments are raising questions.
Bitcoin was invented.
Bitcoin and Bitcoin
and Bitcoin.
This was never a random disappearance. It was a calculated operation executed with precision timing and absolute intent. To understand what truly happened on day 75, we have to rewind to the exact moment the system failed. On February 1st, 2026, the stillness of the Catalina foothills was quietly interrupted by a single invisible action. At exactly 1:44 a.m., just minutes before the entire property went dark, a signal was triggered. This was not noise from a distant network or an anonymous burner device. Analysts later confirmed through cell tower triangulation that the origin point of that signal aligned directly with the GPS location of Tomaso Chioni's vehicle. This was not coincidence. It was confirmation. The house was exposed, the timing was locked, and the plan was already in motion. What followed was not chaos, but coordination. And that level of control only points in one direction. An inside job point 3 minutes later, at exactly 1:47 a.m., movement entered the frame. The doorbell camera captured a figure stepping into view, face concealed, posture controlled. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Every step suggested preparation, not improvisation. This was someone who understood the property beyond surface-level familiarity. They moved like an individual who had studied the environment repeatedly, internalizing its layout until it became instinct. Within seconds, the exterior system was compromised. Power lines were targeted with precision, eliminating visibility and disabling any active surveillance. This was not luck. It was execution. What appeared to the public as a sudden blackout was, in reality, the final phase of a coordinated entry. While attention focused outward, investigators began looking inward. Because the pattern did not reflect forced randomness. It reflected guided access. The deeper the forensic timeline developed, the clearer one conclusion became. The individual outside the house was not working alone. They were operating with knowledge that could only come from inside. But the most critical witness in this entire sequence was not mounted on a wall. It was embedded within the victim herself. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker recorded everything. While cameras were disabled, her body continued documenting the event in real time. At the exact moment the visual feed was lost, her heart rate surged beyond normal physiological limits. This was not a mild stress response. It was an extreme and sustained reaction to trauma. The data reveals a continuous escalation. Her heart did not stabilize. It remained elevated, signaling prolonged distress. This was not a brief encounter. It was a drawn-out struggle. For over 40 minutes, the device logged every spike, every fluctuation, every moment of resistance. Inside her own home, Nancy fought against a force that had already anticipated her every move. The numbers tell a story no eyewitness could replicate. At 2:28 a.m., the signal stopped, not gradually but abruptly. The recording ended at the exact point investigators believe she was removed from the residence. That silence was not absence. It was transition, a shift from controlled environment to unknown territory. And from that moment forward, the case stopped being a missing persons report. It became something far more deliberate. The question investigators could not ignore was simple. Why would this happen, and more importantly, who stood to benefit? As the timeline sharpened, financial records began to surface. What initially appeared to be a stable, affluent structure was, beneath the surface, deeply fractured. Tomaso Chioni was not maintaining wealth. He was sustaining an illusion. Behind closed doors, a complex network of unauthorized transactions, hidden liabilities, and high-risk loans had already begun collapsing. Nancy Guthrie was never meant to be part of that discovery. But weeks before the incident, evidence suggests she became aware of irregular financial activity. Not speculation, not suspicion, awareness. She had access, proximity, and credibility. That combination made her uniquely dangerous to anyone attempting to keep the system intact. She was no longer just a family member. She had become a potential witness. That shift changed everything. Because once exposure becomes possible, desperation follows. Investigators now believe the abduction was not just about removal. It was about containment, eliminating the only individual capable of unraveling the structure while simultaneously creating a financial exit. The ransom demand was not random. It aligned with outstanding obligations. It filled a gap that legal means could no longer cover. This was not a crime driven by impulse. It was driven by pressure. The kind of pressure that builds quietly until it reaches a breaking point. Every decision after that point becomes calculated. Risk is no longer avoided. It is accepted. And in this case, that acceptance led to a plan that required coordination, secrecy, and complete trust between those involved. But there was one flaw. The belief that modern systems could be manipulated without consequence. The assumption that digital tools provided anonymity. Because while the plan accounted for physical movement, it underestimated digital permanence. Every transaction leaves a trace. Every attempt to conceal creates another layer of data. And once investigators shifted their focus to that layer, the structure began to collapse faster than it was built. On February 11th, the investigation entered a new phase. Federal cyber analysts initiated a controlled operation designed not to chase movement, but to provoke it. A minimal transaction was sent directly to the ransom wallet. The amount was insignificant in value, but critical in function. It was not payment. It was a trigger, a digital signal intended to force interaction. And it worked. Shortly after the transfer, activity began. The wallet that had remained static suddenly moved funds through a sequence of intermediate addresses. This technique is commonly used to obscure origin. But in doing so, it creates a visible pathway. Each step adds complexity, but it also adds data points. And with the right tools, those points form a map. Investigators tracked the movement in real time. Not across borders, not across jurisdictions, but across a unified digital ledger that does not recognize geography. The assumption that location would provide protection failed immediately, because the system being used does not rely on physical boundaries. It relies on mathematical consistency, and that consistency exposed everything. The trail led to a centralized exchange, a platform operating under strict identity verification protocols. Once the funds entered that environment, anonymity ended. Records were accessed. Identification was confirmed. The gap between unknown actor and known individual closed completely. What began as a hidden transaction became a direct link to a verified identity. At the same time, behavioral analysis began to shift focus toward internal dynamics. Public appearances, statements, and communication patterns were re-evaluated. What initially appeared as grief began to show inconsistencies. Timing misaligned, details conflicted, and gradually a second layer of involvement emerged. Not external support, but internal coordination. By day 75, the narrative had fully transformed. This was no longer an open-ended investigation. It was a structured case supported by physical evidence, biological data, and digital tracking. 3 independent systems, each confirming the same conclusion. The plan had been executed with precision, but it had also left behind a complete record, and that record was now impossible to erase. The Department of Justice is no longer waiting for uncertainty to resolve itself. They are finalizing a case engineered to hold under relentless scrutiny. The evidence does not erode and the timeline does not bend. What seemed like silence over the past 75 days was not inactivity. It was disciplined restraint. Investigators allowed each action to unfold, capturing every detail as it happened. Every transaction, every communication, every calculated move was documented and secured inside a growing federal archive. Tomaso Chioni and Nancy Guthrie believed complexity would conceal them. It did not. A single trace became a definitive link. That small transaction transformed anonymity into identification. The ransom notes sent to media outlets were never just demands. They were behavioral signatures. When analysts examined the language, they uncovered a consistent pattern. And that pattern revealed more than intent. It exposed design.